The sun was a hot coin pressed against the back of her neck. It didn't just warm her skin, it branded her. Every step sent a fresh wave of agony through her bare feet, cut and bruised by the unforgiving desert floor. Her wrists, bound tight with a scratchy hemp rope, were rubbed raw, bleeding in a slow, steady rhythm that matched the creak of the wagon behind her. The dress, a ghost of cornflower blue, was now a patchwork of dirt and sweat, clinging to her like a second, filthier skin. She kept her head down. It was safer that way. In front of her, 3 men rode on tired horses. They hadn't spoken to her all day, and for that small mercy she was grateful. Their words were always worse than their fists. Their silence was a coiled snake, waiting. The leader, a man named Cobb, was the worst of them. He wasn't loud or flashy with his cruelty. He was quiet, patient. He watched the world with the dead-eyed stillness of a man who'd already decided how you were going to die. He'd sold her once before in a dusty mining town full of desperate men. Then, on a lie about a debt she never owed, he'd taken her back. Now they were heading east, deeper into the territory. She'd heard him mutter it to the others last night over a low fire. Apache Pass. He was going to sell her to the warriors. A new kind of hell, he'd chuckled. Let them have their turn. She remembered a life before this. A life with the smell of baking bread and a mother's soft hands. A life where her name, Ida Grace Monroe, meant something. It meant promises. It meant safety. Now it was just a sound, hollow and useless. Her tongue felt like a shard of rock in her mouth. There were no words left to say, no prayers left to whisper. There was only the heat, the dust, and the slow march toward the end. The wagon rattled to a halt under the skeletal branches of a dead juniper tree. Without being told, she sank to her knees. Her body knew the routine. The sun beat down. A lone vulture circled in the sky above, a patient black comma in a sentence about death. And that's when the air changed. She felt it before they did. A shift in the wind, a sudden sharp silence that cut through the drone of the insects. It was the hush that comes right before a storm breaks. She heard the faint sound of hoofbeats, but they weren't theirs. They were quicker, lighter, more certain. Then she saw them. 5 figures cresting a nearby slope. They seemed to rise from the rocks themselves, dark silhouettes against the burning sky. Bows were raised, feathers trembled in the wind. Apache. Painted for war or for patrol. It didn't matter. Their leader was different. He wore no feathers, just long dark braids that fell over his shoulders. His face was all sharp angles, a jawline that looked like it had been carved from the canyon rock itself. It was a face that had never known how to soften. Cobb's men panicked. They spun their horses around, fumbling for their rifles. One of them managed to fire a shot, a wild, useless crack that echoed and died in the vast emptiness. Ida didn't even flinch. She had stopped reacting to the sound of gunfire weeks ago. It was just another noise in a world full of pain. The 3 riders scattered, disappearing into the scrub brush like frightened quail. The Apache didn't give chase. They simply watched them go. Then, the leader dismounted. He moved with a fluid grace, his feet making no sound on the dry earth. He walked toward her, his eyes fixed on her. His gaze wasn't like Cobb's. It wasn't hungry or cruel. It wasn't like the preachers back home either, full of pity and judgment. It was something else entirely. It was deep and steady, like a river that held ancient secrets and would only speak when it was ready to drown you. He stopped a few feet away. Slowly, almost ceremonially, his hand went to the knife sheathed at his hip. Ida knew what this was. This was the end of one story and the beginning of another, and she had no say in either. But she had one last thing to offer, one last, desperate gamble. She raised her head, the dust on her cheeks like a mask. She found what was left of her voice and pushed the words out, a hollow, desperate whisper into the sudden, heavy silence. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking, "please don't harm me. I'll bear you strong children." The wind stopped. The vulture froze in the sky. The entire world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The Apache leader's hand remained on his knife, his dark eyes unblinking. She held his gaze, refusing to let the tears that burned behind her eyes fall. She would not give him the satisfaction of her fear. For a long, stretched moment, nothing happened. Then, something shifted. It wasn't in his face or his stance. It was deeper, something internal, a choice being made in the silent chambers of his soul. His hand fell away from the knife, letting it rest back in its sheath. Behind him, a low murmur rippled through the other warriors. One spat in the dust, a clear sign of disgust. Another let out a short, scornful laugh. But the leader didn't move. He just kept watching her, his expression impossible to read. Shame, hot and sickening, flooded Ida's body. Not because she had begged, but because she had meant every word. It wasn't about love or desire. It was about survival. It was the only currency she had left. She had no name that mattered, no home to return to, no God who answered her screams. He finally extended a hand toward her. It wasn't an offer to help her up. It was a command, a silent gesture that told her she would walk on her own 2 feet. He would not drag her like an animal. Her legs trembled as she forced herself to stand. She expected him to tie her hands again, to put a rope around her neck. He did none of those things. There was only silence. And so, she walked. She walked away from the abandoned wagon and the ghost of Cobb, and into a new, uncertain world. The Apache camp was an hour's journey, hidden in a cleft between towering rock walls where the desert floor softened into green brush and mesquite trees. It was a place that felt protected, secret. They didn't take her to the center of the camp. They placed her on the edge, under a sun-bleached tarp next to a cold, dead fire pit. It was a clear message. You are here, but you are not one of us. No one spoke to her. No one offered her food or water. But no one beat her either. She sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach, as if trying to hold herself together. For 4 days, she hadn't spoken her own name. She wasn't even sure she could remember the sound of it anymore. That night, as the coyotes sang their lonely songs to the moon, the braided leader came and sat across the dead fire from her. He built a new fire, his movements economical and precise. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows across his unreadable face. He didn't speak. He didn't sleep. He just watched her. His silence wasn't cruel like Cobb's. It was old. It felt ancient, heavy with the weight of things he could never say. As the fire crackled, she found a sliver of courage. "What's your name?" she whispered. There was no answer, only the wind sighing through the canyon. But others in the camp had a name for him. The next morning, an old warrior with a crooked, milky eye and a staff scorched by the sun stopped near her. He looked her up and down, then spat on the ground near her feet. "Tozelin," he grunted in broken, guttural English. "He spared you. Now you are his shame, his weight." She didn't understand all the words, but she understood the meaning. Shame was a universal language. The hostility was a wall she couldn't see but could feel with every fiber of her being. Later that day, a young girl with eyes as hard as black stones walked past. She carried a water flask and deliberately tipped it over, letting the precious liquid sink into the thirsty dust, just inches from Ida's reach. A deliberate act of cruelty. Ida didn't move. She didn't crawl for the damp patch of dirt. Her dignity was a tiny, flickering ember, and she would guard it with her life. It had to live somewhere, even if it was only in the silent refusal to beg. On the 3rd morning, something changed. She woke to find a piece of bread resting on a clean, folded cloth beside her sleeping mat. It was coarse, hard bread, but she ate every last crumb, her throat aching with unshed tears. The bread was still warm. That meant someone hadn't just left it for her. They had brought it directly from the fire. She looked up, and he was there. Tozelin, sitting in the same spot as the night before, watching her. His face was a mask, his eyes holding no judgment, no pity, no desire. She whispered the only words she could, "Thank you." He didn't nod, he didn't speak, he just blinked once, a slow, deliberate movement, and in that tiny gesture she felt a flicker of something that wasn't cruelty. When she looked again, he was gone. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows across the canyon, someone left a shallow dish of cool water for her. As she washed the grime from her face, she saw the first stars appear between the canyon walls. They looked brighter here, sharper. She thought of her mother, of the songs she used to sing while braiding Ida's hair. "Always be gentle," her mother had said, "even when the world is not." Her mother had died birthing a son who never drew breath. Ida had carried that guilt like a stone in her heart for years. Deep in the camp, a single drumbeat pulsed, then fell silent. She listened, her body tense, but nothing followed. Just the quiet hum of the desert night. She was a girl with no name, in a place that didn't want her, watched by a man who spoke only in silence. A bird with a broken wing, too stubborn to die in the dirt. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, another warrior passed by her. It was the one with the crooked eye, the one who had called Tozalin's name. He didn't stop, but he muttered as he walked past, his voice low and heavy. "He carries your shame now, too, a heavy burden for a chief to bear." She didn't sleep that night, not from fear. Something else was stirring inside her. The slow, dawning realization that shame, when shared, begins to lose its power. And that mercy, when it comes in silence, can echo louder than any war drum. She was wrong about this place. She was wrong about Tozalin. This wasn't the beginning of the end. This was the start of something else entirely. And she had a terrible feeling it was going to be far more dangerous than just being a captive. The next morning, the sun bled over the canyon rim, painting the world in shades of dusty gold. Ida woke on a rough woolen mat that hadn't been there the night before. Her body ached, a deep, resonant pain that had become her constant companion. But something inside her, a small, hard knot of despair, had begun to loosen. It felt like the bruised skin of a fallen peach, damaged but refusing to rot. A clay jug sat near the mat. Simple, unmarked. It hadn't been there when she'd fallen into an exhausted sleep. She stared at it for a long time. Was it for her? Or was it another test? A temptation designed to make her show weakness. In this place, every gesture was layered with meaning she couldn't decipher. She decided it didn't matter. Her thirst was a fire in her throat. She crawled to the jug, her movements slow and deliberate. She wouldn't snatch it. She wouldn't gulp it down like a starving animal. She tipped it to her lips and sipped. The water was cool and clean, and it felt like a blessing flowing through her. Her eyes stung, not with pain, but with the startling shock of a kindness she hadn't earned and hadn't asked for. This wasn't a transaction. There was no debt attached. Across the clearing, Tozalin sat with his back to her, carving a piece of wood with a small flint knife. His hands moved with a slow, methodical grace. He didn't look at her, but she knew. She knew the water and the mat had come from him. The camp was slowly waking around her. Women tended to fires, their movements practiced and efficient. Children, their faces still soft with sleep, chased dogs through the smoke. Men gathered their hunting gear, their voices a low murmur. No one looked at her. No one spoke her name. It was as if she existed in a pocket of silence, a ghost haunting the edges of their lives. But the silence was changing. It was no longer entirely hostile. It was now laced with something else. Curiosity. A girl, not much older than Ida, with obsidian braids and a necklace of hammered silver coins, walked past her. She slowed her steps, her eyes raking over Ida's torn dress and tangled hair. She muttered something in her own tongue, her lips curling into a smirk. Ida didn't need a translation to understand the contempt. The girl then dropped a small, sharp pebble at Ida's feet, a clear token of her disgust, before walking away. Ida refused to react. She kept her gaze fixed on the distant canyon wall. If they wanted to see her shame, she would deny them the satisfaction. A few moments later, two young boys, emboldened by the girl's display, wandered closer. One of them tossed a twig that landed on her leg. The other one called out a single, garbled English word. "Crow." He laughed, a high, cruel sound. Then a voice cut through the air, low, sharp, and laced with an authority that was absolute. "Enough!" It was Tozalin. The boys froze, their laughter dying in their throats. They cast a wide-eyed, terrified glance at their chief, then scrambled away like rabbits fleeing a hawk. Ida risked a look in his direction. He hadn't moved. The knife in his hand was still, the carving forgotten. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the spot where the boys had been, his eyes narrowed, his jaw set like granite. And in that moment, she understood something profound. He wasn't just watching her. He was protecting her. But why? Why would the leader of this tribe risk the anger of his people to protect a worthless outsider? An enemy? It made no sense. Unless the old warrior was right. Unless he truly did see her as his burden. His shame. The thought was a cold stone in the pit of her stomach. She wasn't a person to him. She was a responsibility, a stain on his honor that he had to manage. That afternoon, the heat was a physical weight. She found a sliver of shade behind a large boulder and tried to braid her tangled hair, her fingers clumsy and slow. Her mind kept replaying Cobb's cruel laughter, the averted eyes of the people in her town, the preacher's wife who had offered her a pie with one hand and pointed her out to the sheriff with the other. The world had never been kind, but this place was a different kind of cruel. It was honest in its hatred. She closed her eyes, trying to summon the memory of her mother's voice, singing a song about a river that could wash away sorrow. Her own throat felt too tight to make a sound. Soft footsteps on the dirt brought her eyes open. Tozalin stood before her. He wasn't looking at her, but at a spot just beside her. He held out his hand. In his palm was a coarse biscuit, still warm from a fire. He offered it without a word. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough, calloused. She took a bite. It tasted of ash and grain, and something else she couldn't name, something almost sacred. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You didn't have to." His voice. It was the first full sentence he had ever spoken to her. It was deeper than she had imagined, a low rumble like distant thunder. She looked up at him then, really looked at him for the first time. His face was lined not with age, but with the weight of countless hard decisions. His eyes weren't just brown, they were the color of the deep earth, and they held storms. "You're not like them," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "The other men. Cobb." "No," he agreed, his voice flat. He paused, and then added, the words heavy with a history she couldn't comprehend. "But I was." He sat on the rock near her, close but not touching, giving her space. For a long time, they just sat in the simmering heat, the silence stretching between them. She finished the bread, and he watched the wind play with the dry leaves on the ground. "Why did you stop them?" she finally asked, her voice quiet. "That day, my captors." His jaw tightened, a flicker of some old, deep pain in his eyes. "They wanted death," he said simply. "For you, for us." "And you gave them life instead?" she asked, confused. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and piercing. "You did." She blinked, her heart giving a sudden hard thump against her ribs. "You mean what I said? About—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The shame was too great. He nodded once. "I didn't mean it like they thought," she rushed to explain, her face burning. "I wasn't offering myself. I just wanted to live." "I know," he said. Those two words, spoken in his low, quiet voice, held more compassion and understanding than she had ever known. They were a balm on a wound she didn't even know was still bleeding. She had to look away, afraid he would see the tears welling in her eyes. Far above, a hawk soared on the thermal currents, its cry a lonely, wild sound. The sounds of the camp, the chatter of women, the laughter of children, seemed to fade into the background. In this small, still circle of shade and silence, the world had shrunk to just the two of them, and something had fundamentally shifted between them. But she was making a terrible mistake. She was seeing kindness where there was only strategy. She was seeing compassion where there was only calculation. Tosalin wasn't protecting her. He was using her. And she was about to find out why. That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned to a blaze of orange and purple, an elder with eyes clouded by age and wisdom stood before the main fire. He began to speak, his voice a reedy chant that silenced the entire camp. He was telling the story of a dream, a vision. Ida couldn't understand the words, but she understood the gravity. A murmur went through the gathered people, a ripple of unease. She heard a word whispered, over and over, a word that sounded like her own name, but twisted, different. Tosalin stood beside the elder, his face grim. When the story of the dream was finished, he glanced in her direction, just for a second, but it was enough. Then Red Otter, the warrior with the crooked eye and a face like weathered stone, stepped forward. His voice was sharp, cutting. It was a judgment, a warning. He pointed a gnarled finger directly at her. Again, she didn't understand the words, but she felt them in her bones. They were words of accusation. After the speeches, the people melted away, retreating to the safety of their own family circles. She was left alone by her small, cold fire, feeling more isolated than ever. What was in that dream? What had they accused her of? A young girl, the same one who had smirked at her before, silently approached. She placed a small clay bowl of stew on the ground near Ida and scurried away without a word. Ida ate it slowly, the warm broth a small comfort in the sudden chill that had descended on the camp. When she set the empty bowl aside, she saw it, tucked into the edge of her sleeping mat, right where her head would rest. It was a single hawk feather, pale brown tipped in white. It hadn't been dropped by the wind. It had been placed there deliberately. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't a promise of friendship. She knew, with a certainty that made her blood run cold, that it was a message. A feather from a hawk, a predator, a killer. This wasn't an act of kindness from Tosalin. It was a warning. I am the hawk, it seemed to say, and you are the mouse. I can protect you, or I can crush you. Do not forget it. She lay back on her mat, clutching the feather to her chest. She had been a fool to see compassion in his eyes. He wasn't her savior. He was just a different kind of cage. And the bars were closing in. For days, the hawk feather sat tucked away in a fold of her dress, a secret weight against her skin. It was a constant, chilling reminder of her precarious position. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't even a prisoner. She was a piece on a board, moved by a player whose rules she didn't understand. She tried to make herself useful, to fade into the background. She rose before the sun, sweeping the ashes from the communal fire pits. She gathered firewood until her hands, once soft from kneading dough, were a mass of blisters and calluses. She even tended to a scrawny camp dog with a wounded paw, who now followed her everywhere, a silent, four-legged shadow. No one told her to do these things, but no one told her to stop, either. She existed in a state of invisible utility. Tosalin kept his distance. He would return from hunts and leave a strip of dried meat on the stone by her sleeping mat, never looking at her, never speaking. The gestures continued, but now she saw them through a different lens. They weren't kindness. They were maintenance. He was keeping his asset alive. One afternoon he found her by a stream, trying to wash the grime from her tattered dress. He sat on a rock nearby, holding a bundle of juniper branches. "The bark makes a good tea," he said, his voice startling her, "for fever, and for those who have pain in their sleep." She looked up at him, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm. Do you? She asked, her voice a whisper. Have pain in your sleep? He didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the running water, his expression unreadable. But he stayed there in silence until the sky began to bleed into the deep indigo of twilight. The silence itself felt like a confession. That night, as the campfires burned like scattered stars against the darkness, she hummed an old lullaby her mother used to sing. It was a sad tune, about finding your way home through a field of thorns. Her voice was rusty and cracked, but she didn't care. The little dog at her feet whined softly, his ears twitching. That song, I know it. Tozalin's voice came from the shadows behind her. He moved with that unnerving silence of his, emerging from the darkness like a ghost. He crouched beside her fire, the flames illuminating the hard planes of his face. He laid something on the ground between them, a small, smooth stone, pale in the firelight. Carved into its surface was a delicate sunburst. It was worn, as if it had been held and rubbed by a thumb for many years. It was my mother's, he said, his gaze still averted. Ida hesitated, her fingers hovering over the stone. Then, why are you giving it to me? I didn't say I was giving it to you, he replied, his voice flat. I carved it for her. After she was gone, I never gave it to her. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief. She picked up the stone. It was cool against her skin. I don't understand, she whispered. You don't need to, he said. A girl from a nearby tent passed by, muttering something sharp in her native tongue. Ida had grown used to the insults, but this time she saw Tozalin's jaw tighten, a muscle jumping in his cheek. They say I shame you, Ida said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. They say I bring weakness to the tribe, that the spirits are angry you let me live. They are wrong, he said, his voice a low growl. They see a white woman, and they see the ghosts of every treaty broken, every promise turned to dust. They look at you and see a mirror of their own pain. They don't like the face that stares back. And what do you see? She dared to ask. He was silent for a long moment. Then, so slowly she barely had time to react, he reached out. His fingers, rough and calloused, brushed against her temple, tucking a stray piece of hair behind her ear. It was the first time he had touched her with anything resembling gentleness. His hand smelled of cedar and leather and the clean scent of the desert night. I see someone who is still breathing, he said, his voice soft. That is a rare thing in this land. Her throat closed. She felt a heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. It was confusing, dangerous. One moment he was the hawk, the next he was this. A man drowning in his own quiet grief. I don't know how to belong here, she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. You're not supposed to belong, he answered, pulling his hand back. You're supposed to survive. Belonging is a luxury. Just then, footsteps approached, heavy and purposeful. Red Otter stood at the edge of the firelight, his arms folded across his broad chest. His face, etched with the lines of countless battles and bitter winters, was a mask of grim disapproval. He spoke to Tozalin in the rapid, clipped tones of their language. It was an argument, a demand. Though Ida couldn't understand the words, she understood the tension that crackled between the two men. Red Otter gestured toward her, then toward the dark mouth of the canyon, his meaning clear. Send her away. Tozalin's replies were low and steady, but unbending. He shook his head. Red Otter's voice rose, sharp with anger. He spat on the ground, turned his back, and stalked off into the darkness. The air was thick with the aftermath of the confrontation. What did he say? Ida asked, her voice trembling slightly. He says you bring division, Tozalin said, his gaze fixed on the flames. He says the warriors whisper that my strength is failing, that I am bewitched by a ghost. And what did you tell him? I told him the wind brings change, he said, finally looking at her, whether we ask for it or not. He paused. He is right, though. You do not belong here. You are not one of us. I know, she whispered, the words like ash in her mouth. "Neither am I," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. Before she could ask what he meant, he stood up. He extended his hand to her. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. Together in silence, they walked away from the fire, through the sleeping camp. Eyes watched them from the dark doorways of the wickiups, but no one spoke. He led her to a massive cedar tree that grew from a fissure in the canyon wall, its branches reaching for the stars like gnarled arms. He picked up a flat, smooth stone, the size of her palm, and handed it to her. "Mark it," he commanded. "With what?" "Whatever you carry inside you." She knelt in the dust. Using the sharp point of a thorn, she scratched a crude image onto the stone's surface, a crooked sun, and beneath it, a small, winding river. She didn't know why. It was just the image that came to her mind. She handed it back to him. He looked at it, and for the first time since she had met him, a true smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, chasing away some of the shadows. He took the stone and placed it carefully among the gnarled roots at the base of the tree. There were other stones there, she now saw. Dozens of them, each marked with a different symbol, an altar of memories. "We leave signs," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "For those who come after. So they know we were here. So they know we survived." Later that night, as she lay on her mat, the carved sunburst bead clutched tight in her hand, she thought about that tree. She thought about his words. "Neither am I." What did he mean? How could the chief not belong? And then, another, more terrifying thought crept into her mind. The song he'd recognized. The one her mother used to sing. It was an old folk song from the East, a song about a river back in the settled lands. How could a Chiricahua chief, born and raised in these canyons, possibly know a song from a world away? It was impossible, unless he wasn't from this world at all. The hawk feather, the secret altar, the song. It was all a puzzle, and she was starting to see the horrifying shape of it. Tozalin wasn't just a chief with a secret grief. He was a man with a secret identity. And she was beginning to suspect that his past, and hers, were intertwined in a way that would not lead to belonging, but to blood. The wind that blew in from the east the next morning had teeth. It was sharp and brittle, and it carried the scent of dust and distant trouble. Ida felt a prickle of unease on her skin, a primal sense of warning that had been honed by weeks of living on a knife's edge. Her fingers froze over the basin of water she was using, her head lifting. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Too many. And they were heavy, shod with iron. Not Apache horses, white men. The first gunshot was a whip crack that shattered the morning stillness. It wasn't aimed at anyone. It was a declaration, an announcement of power. The camp exploded into a maelstrom of controlled chaos. Women snatched up children and spears, their faces grim. Men grabbed bows and knives, melting into the rocks at the edge of the clearing with practiced speed. Ida's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden silence of her own breath. She saw Tozalin, his face a mask of cold fury, already running toward the canyon mouth, shouting commands in his own language. A part of her, the old Ida, wanted to hide, to curl into a ball and wait for the violence to pass. But that Ada was gone. Instead, she turned and scooped up the little dog that was cowering by the fire, holding its trembling body close to her chest. 4 riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon. They sat their horses with the easy arrogance of men who believed in the power of their guns. At their head was a man with a silver star pinned to his vest. Marshal Harmon. His face was weathered, his eyes a pale, cold blue. Behind him rode a man with a smug, clean-shaven face she recognized with a jolt of pure ice. He was kin to Cobb, one of the men from the town who had watched and done nothing. "We're not looking for trouble," the marshal called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "We're here for the girl." Tozalin stepped forward from the rocks, flanked by Red Otter and 2 other warriors. Their bows were drawn, arrows nocked. There is no girl here for you. Tozalin's voice was as steady and unyielding as the stone around them. Don't play games, Chief, the settler sneered from behind the marshal. We know she's here. She's white. She belongs with us. She was taken, Red Otter growled, his English thick but clear. No one was taken, Tozalin replied, his eyes locked on the marshal. She's ruined, the settler spat, his face contorted with disgust. Even if you let her go, your people won't want her. Let's not make this messy. Just give her back. Behind them, a younger Apache warrior, his face painted in stark lines of black and white, raised his bow higher. Red Otter shot him a look, a low growl of warning. The air was electric, a single spark away from erupting into a bloodbath. And then, Ida started walking. She moved out from behind the cover of the wiki-ups, the small dog still clutched in her arms. She walked slowly, deliberately, into the open space between the two groups. She lifted her chin, her feet bare and steady on the hard-packed earth. The wind whipped her hair across her face and tugged at the hem of her torn dress. Marshal Harmon's eyes narrowed. Girl? Ada Grace? Come on now, son. Let's get you home. You don't belong in a place like this. She stopped about 10 feet from his horse. She looked past him, at the settler, then back at the marshal. That is not my home, she said, her voice surprisingly clear and strong. The settler barked a laugh. Girl, it's the only place you ain't nothing but a savage's stray. Tozalin took a step toward her, but she held up a hand, a small, sharp gesture that stopped him in his tracks. She had to do this, alone. You didn't come here for me, she said, her voice ringing with a newfound certainty. You came for a story where you're the hero who rescues the poor, captured white girl, a story you can tell back in town to make yourselves feel righteous. She took a breath. You didn't come to save me. You came to silence me. The marshal's face tightened. A flicker of something, surprise, fear, crossed his features. You're confused, girl. You've been through a trauma. We can help you. No, she said, shaking her head. You left me. All of you. When Cobb sold me the first time, you looked away. When he dragged me out of town, you barred your doors. You let it happen. She turned her gaze to the settler. Your kin spit on me and called me a whore, and you stood right there and laughed. Suddenly, Red Otter stepped forward. He held his knife not as a weapon, but as a ritual object. He walked to the space between Ida and Tozalin and thrust the knife into the dirt. The blade pointed down, the handle toward the sky. It was a formal, ancient gesture. He began to speak in Apache, his voice grave and solemn. Tozalin replied, his tone equally formal. What is happening? Ida whispered to Tozalin, her eyes fixed on the gleaming blade. Tozalin's gaze met hers. It was intense, heavy with the weight of the moment. He is invoking the old law, the law of sanctuary. He says if I choose to defend you, I must take your name into my clan. Your shame becomes my shame. Your blood becomes my blood. If I step back, you belong to them. He paused, and his next words struck her like a physical blow. He has asked me to let you decide. The knife. It wasn't just a blade in the dirt. It was a choice, a life, her life. It sat there, a silent question mark between two worlds, two futures, the world that had abandoned her and the world that despised her. Her mind raced. Why would Tozalin do this? Why give her the choice? It put him in an impossible position. If he defended her, he would deepen the rift with his own people. If he didn't, he would be sending her back to men who clearly wanted her dead. Unless that was the point. This wasn't about her freedom. This was a political move, a test. He was forcing Red Otter's hand. He was showing the tribe that he was a man of law, a man of honor, even for an outsider. But there was another layer. Marshal Harmon. He wasn't just a lawman. He was here to clean up a mess, Cobb's mess, and she was the loose end. Going back with him wasn't going home. It was going to her grave. She understood. Tozalin wasn't offering her a home. He was offering her the only chance she had to stay alive. She knelt in the dust beside the knife. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle. She closed her fingers around the worn leather grip. Then, with a strength she didn't know she possessed, she pulled it from the earth. But she didn't hand it to Tozalin. She turned the knife in her hand, the blade pointing down, and with a single sharp movement, she drove it back into the earth at her own feet. "I am not a burden to be carried," she said, her voice ringing with power. "And I do not belong to anyone." She looked up, her gaze sweeping from the stunned face of the marshal to the grim visage of Red Otter, and finally resting on Tozalin. "But I choose to stay here. I choose to stand with the man who saw me when no one else would." A dead silence fell over the canyon. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Red Otter stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock and something else, a flicker of grudging respect. He gave a short, sharp nod to Tozalin, then turned and walked back to the rocks without another word. One of the marshal's men raised his rifle. "Marshal, what are we doing? Let's just take her!" But Harmon held up a hand, his face pale. The smug certainty was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling caution. He had come here expecting a frightened, broken girl. He had found something else entirely. Something dangerous. "She's made her choice," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He wheeled his horse around. "But she's white!" the settler protested, his face red with fury. "She's been shamed! You can't just leave her!" "She ain't our concern anymore," Harmon said, his voice flat and final. He spurred his horse, and the four riders galloped away, swallowed by the dust and the vast, indifferent landscape. Their shadows vanished first. Ida didn't get up right away. She stayed kneeling on the ground, her hand resting on the hilt of the knife, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm of victory. Tozalin knelt beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't smile. He just watched her, his eyes full of a new, complex light. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered, a tear finally tracing a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. "But less than I was before." That night, the fires in the camp seemed to burn a little brighter. There was still a distance, a caution in the eyes of the other women. But the open hostility was gone, replaced by a wary curiosity. An elder woman handed her a cup of warm broth without a word. A young boy, sent by his mother, shyly offered her a woven shawl to ward off the desert chill. Tozalin sat with her by her fire for hours. He didn't speak, but he had started carving a new bead. This one was different. He worked the wood slowly, his knife making soft, scraping sounds in the quiet night. He didn't offer it to her, but he didn't hide it either. She looked up at the endless river of stars. She thought about names, not the ones you are given, but the ones you earn, the ones you claim for yourself in the fire. The wind returned, but it didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like a promise of harder days to come, yes, but also a promise of strength. She had done more than just choose a place to live. She had declared war on the world that had tried to erase her. And in the heart of this hostile canyon, beside a silent, enigmatic chief, she had just fired the first shot. Life in the canyon settled into a new rhythm, a quiet truce. Ida was no longer the pariah, but she wasn't yet one of them. She was a third thing, a strange new element introduced into their world. She worked alongside the women, learning to grind mesquite beans into flour, to weave baskets from yucca fibers, her hands growing tougher, more capable with each passing day. The women still spoke to her mostly through gestures, but the gestures were no longer dismissive. They were instructional, inclusive. A small girl, who had once thrown stones at her, now shyly brought her a wildflower she'd picked. Ida accepted it with a smile, and the girl ran away giggling. It was a small crack in the wall of their suspicion, but light was beginning to seep through. Tozalin remained a puzzle. He watched her, always from a distance, the silent protector, the hawk in the sky. Their conversations were rare and brief, fragments of meaning exchanged in the twilight hours. He taught her the names of the stars in his language, the properties of the desert plants. He spoke of the ways of the deer and the mountain lion, but never of himself. One evening, as they sat by her fire, she worked up the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. "The song," she said, her voice low. "The lullaby I was humming. The one about the river and the thorns. You said you knew it." He stopped his eternal carving, his hands going still. He stared into the fire, his profile etched by the flames. "I heard it once," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "A long time ago." "But it's a song from the East," she pressed gently. From the world I came from. How could you have heard it here?" He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low whisper, like stones grinding together. "My mother, she was not Apache." The world tilted on its axis. "What?" Ida breathed, her mind reeling. "She was captured," he said, the words costing him a visible effort. "Like you. Taken from a wagon train when she was a girl. My father, he was the war chief then. He took her as his wife." This changed everything. The silence, the grief, the kindness hidden beneath the hard exterior. He wasn't just a chief dealing with an outsider. He was the son of an outsider. He was looking at her and seeing the ghost of his own mother. "She sang that song," he continued, his voice rough with memory. "Every night. She never forgot it. She never forgot where she came from." "What happened to her?" Ida asked softly. His jaw tightened. "She died. When I was a boy. A fever took her." He looked up at Ida then, his eyes burning with an intensity that stole her breath. "They said it was because she was weak, because her blood was not of the people. Red Otter, his father was my father's rival. He used my mother's presence to spread whispers, to say my father was tainted, unfit to lead." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Red Otter's hostility wasn't just about Ida. It was an old wound, a political rivalry passed down from father to son. And Ida, another outsider, was a weapon being used in that same ancient war. Tozalin wasn't just protecting her. He was reliving the most painful part of his own history. "I am sorry," she whispered, the words inadequate. "It was a long time ago," he said, but the pain in his eyes was fresh. Before she could say more, a runner stumbled into the camp, his chest heaving, his face slick with sweat. He gasped out a message to the warriors gathered at the main fire. A wave of alarm spread through the camp. Tozalin was on his feet in an instant, all personal grief gone, replaced by the cold, hard authority of a chief. He strode to the center of the camp, listening intently to the runner's report. Ida watched, her heart sinking. She saw Red Otter's face, grim and hard in the firelight. He was arguing with Tozalin, his gestures sharp and angry. He kept pointing toward the west, then back at Tozalin, his voice rising. A young woman who had recently started speaking to Ida in broken English crept to her side, her eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" Ida asked. "Raiders," the woman whispered. "A rival band. They have been driven from their lands by drought. They are hungry, desperate. They are coming this way." Red Otter stood before the assembled warriors, his voice a powerful roar. He was a force of nature, a charismatic and respected war leader, and he was using this crisis. He spoke of bad omens, of a weakening of their spirit since the arrival of the outsider. He said the spirits were angry, that this raid was a punishment. He was turning the fear of the people against Tozalin, and against her. "I will stay," Ida said, her voice cutting through the rising tide of panic. Every head turned in her direction. The camp fell silent. Red Otter stared at her, his eyes narrowed to slits. "You are not a warrior. You are a woman. A white woman. You will be a liability." "I have never claimed to be a warrior," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "But I know how to tend to the wounded. I know how to keep children quiet and calm in the face of fear. I have done it before." She looked past him, at the faces of the women, the children. "Let me help." A long, tense moment passed. To her astonishment, It was Red Otter who finally gave a curt, reluctant nod. It wasn't acceptance. It was a pragmatic decision. In a crisis, every pair of hands was needed. That night, as the men prepared for battle, painting their faces and chanting the old war songs, Ida sat with Tozalin while he sharpened the blade of his knife. "You should be with the other women and the children," he said, not looking up from his work. "In the hidden caves. It is safer there." "I am where I need to be," she replied quietly. He finally stopped, the scraping sound of steel on stone ceasing. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "You understand what is coming. These are not soldiers. They are desperate men. They will not show mercy." "Neither did Cobb," she said simply. "I am not the same girl he dragged through the desert." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Are you ready to die for this place? For these people who have shown you nothing but contempt?" "No," she said honestly. "I am not ready to die, but I am ready to live as if I belong somewhere." Just before the false dawn, the first arrow hissed out of the darkness and thudded into a wooden post at the edge of the camp. It was followed by a chorus of high, wild war cries. The battle had begun. Tozalin was a blur of motion, a silent, deadly force moving through the chaos. The camp erupted into a brutal, close-quarters fight. Ida didn't watch. She ran to the caves where the women and children were hiding, her arms full of water skins and strips of cloth for bandages. She spent the next hour in the darkness of the cave, tending to a wounded elder, calming a crying child, her voice a low, soothing hum as she sang the song of the river. Outside, the sounds of battle raged, a terrifying symphony of screams, grunts, and the sickening thud of blades hitting flesh. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The silence that fell was more terrifying than the noise. She stepped out of the cave into a scene from a nightmare. The ground was littered with bodies. 2 Apache warriors were dead. 3 more were gravely wounded. But the raiders had been decimated. Among the dead, she saw a boy, no older than 16, his face frozen in a mask of surprise. And then she saw Tozalin. He was standing over the body of the raiders' leader, his knife dripping blood. There was a deep gash on his arm, blood soaking the sleeve of his shirt. He looked up, and his eyes found hers across the smoke-filled clearing. It wasn't the look of a chief to a subject. It was the look of one survivor to another. She ran to him. "You're hurt." He looked down at his arm as if just noticing the wound. "It is nothing." "It is not nothing," she said, her voice firm. She ripped a long strip of cloth from the hem of her dress and began to wrap the wound, her fingers sure and steady. He let her, his body rigid, his eyes never leaving her face. "I told you I would stay," she whispered. He nodded, a barely perceptible movement. "I knew you would." The remaining warriors gathered around them, their faces grim. Red Otter was among them, his face streaked with blood and sweat. He looked from Tozalin's wounded arm to Ida's determined face, and then at the dead and wounded scattered around them. Ida turned to face them all. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "I came to this place broken," she said, her voice ringing out in the stillness. "But I have bled on this ground with you. I have fought for your children alongside you. You do not have to call me one of your own, but you can no longer call me an outsider." The wind sighed through the canyon, carrying her words. Red Otter stared at her, his hard eyes filled with a complex, unreadable emotion. Then, he did something that stunned everyone into silence. He bent down, scooped a handful of dust and ash from a dying fire, and stepped toward her. He reached out and marked her forehead with it, a dark gray stripe. He spoke a single word in his own language, a word she didn't know, but felt in the marrow of her bones. Later, after the dead had been attended to, and the wounded carried away, Tozalin came to her. The sun was rising, washing the blood-soaked ground in the clean, innocent light of a new day. In his hand, he held the bead he had been carving. It was finished. He had carved 2 sunbursts on it, side by side. He pressed it into her palm. "Edawun," he said softly. What does it mean? She asked, her fingers closing around the warm wood. It means the one who stayed, he said. He looked at her and a faint smile touched his lips. It is your name now. She clutched the bead, the name a strange and beautiful weight in her heart. And you? She asked. Tozalin, what does your name mean? He looked out at the canyon, at the endless, unforgiving landscape that was his home. It means the one who watches, he said. He then turned back to her, his dark eyes holding hers. But I think perhaps it is time for that to change. She laughed, the sound free and real in the morning air, and as she stood there, with her new name, her new purpose, she realized the truth. The world doesn't give you a name. You earn it, you fight for it, you bleed for it, and when you finally claim it, not even the wind can take it away. But she was wrong, dead wrong. This wasn't the end of the story, it was a new, more terrifying beginning. Because the name he had given her, Etawun, didn't just mean the one who stayed. It had another, older meaning, a secret meaning known only to the chief. It meant the bait. And the trap was about to be sprung.